stations now open. Learn about K-Line destinations, how to ride, and more at metro.net/K-Line. KBLA Talk 1580 is the official station of the K-Line.
Welcome to Agenda for America, an African-American perspective. A national conversation presented by Smiley Audio Media Incorporated. KBLA Talk 1580 and executive produced by Tavis Smiley. Tonight's conversation is Why We Can't Wait, the urgency of now, and features an all-star panel who you will meet in just a moment. The moderator this evening is Tavis Smiley, host of Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580. We hope you enjoy Agenda for America, an African-American perspective, exclusively on KBLA Talk 1580. Here now, Tavis Smiley, Tavis Smiley, Tavis Smiley.
At this critical moment in our struggle for freedom and justice, I am delighted to have you join us for a dialogue that is going to be rich, I promise you. Let me commence by thanking my colleagues Areva Martin for her brilliant moderation of the program State of Black Women in America, Dominique DiPrima for the State of Black Youth in America, and Zoe Williams for the State of Black Men in America. Three brilliant panels that precede the one that we are going to have in just a moment here. So thanks to Areva Martin, to Dominique DiPrima, and to Zoe Williams for brilliantly moderating these three great discussions every week this month of October. I believe that every race of people ought to be judged by the best they've been able to produce and not by the worst. And over the next 2 hours, you are going to hear from some of the brightest minds I have ever encountered in my working witness down through the years. In our second hour, Michael Eric Dyson will join us, so you might want to grab your thesaurus right about now. We'll also be joined in the second hour by the towering public intellectual Connie Rice, a brilliant civil rights attorney. And just to remind my friends back east that smart black folk are not a commodity found only on the eastern seaboard. UCLA's Dr. Tyrone Howard joins us in hour two as well. Hour two is going to be fire. But don't get it twisted, we're bringing the smoke in hour one. I am pleased to welcome to this conversation a brilliant and big thinker, a political strategist and tactician, the former mayor of the Big Easy, and now the seasoned president and CEO of the National Urban League, Mark Morial. Mr. President, how are you, sir?
Hey, Tavis, good to be with you, man, and appreciate your voice and your power and your work and your witness.
Man,
thank you for having me this evening.
Thank you for those kind words. My delight to have you. I call Ashley Woodard Henderson my secret weapon. She is courage personified, and I am deliciously proud of the work she's doing to carry on the grand tradition of the Highlander Center. I am delighted to invite Ashley Woodard Henderson into this dialogue. Ashley, how are you?
I'm doing well, Brother Tavis. Thanks for having me.
My delight to have you. It is a sublime joy to once again greet the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, the man I regard as the greatest moral leader in America today, the MacArthur genius, the Reverend William J. Barber II. Doc, how are you, sir?
Tavis, thank you so much, and to your other guests, thank you for giving us this opportunity to cry loud with the scriptures require that we do. Thank you so much.
Indeed. Bishop, let me start with you since you are on the microphone. The subject of our conversation this evening, the title, as you well know, is Agenda for America and African-American Perspective, Why We Can't Wait, the Urgency of Now. Those words, of course, taken from the person I regard as the greatest American this country's ever produced. To my mind, that is Martin Luther King Jr. Those are his words. Why we can't wait, the urgency of now. I start with this question for each of you. Reverend Barber, you first. What is, to your mind, sir, the urgency of now?
The urgency of now, Tavis, is that we are 59 years still too late. One of the things that ought to irk us deeply is that 59 years ago at the March on Washington, for instance, Bayard Rustin, working with Dr. King, declared that we needed a $2 minimum wage, which would be $15 today. 59 years later, we still do not have a living wage. 55 million Americans work every day for less than living wage. That's a policy decision. We had one vote in Congress this past year. 49 Republicans and 2 Democrats said no to 55 million people, and to 43 million African Americans, they said, stay in poverty as you are. And that is an urgency. We should be concerned about years later, we still do not have universal health care. 87 million people in this country every day get up either uninsured or underinsured. 59 years later, we have less voting rights today than we had August 6, 1965. And we've still not seen that fixed in the Congress, and we only had one vote, even in the current Congress, to fix that. And so we can't wait with our votes. You heard in the quote, as I conclude this part, when Dr. King talked about registering and voting, he connected it to health care and education, to policies. Our votes are not support for candidates, black or white. They are demands, and demands around policy. And lastly, the urgency of now, Tavis, is we've got to decide how much longer we're going to accept all this death, because every negative piece of public policy that produces and keeps poverty and low wealth alive, people die. 700 people a day die from poverty, 250,000 a year, and 60.9% of black people exist in poverty and low wealth today, 59 years after the March on Washington. This is the urgency of now and why we cannot wait.
This is going to be rich, as I promise. I can feel it already. Ashley Woody Henderson, for you, what is the urgency of now? What can we not wait on any longer? Ashley?
Can you hear me?
I hear you now.
All right. I mean, I think we can keep it with Dr. King, right? Militarism, white supremacy, and white supremacist political violence and capitalism continue to be why there is an urgency now. And I would add from our last conversation together, Tavis, that fascism is not only going to happen, it's in a foregone conclusion sort of way if we continue to wait. But for many of us, particularly in the southern part of the United States, fascism is already a reality. You can't look at the state of Florida and Ron DeSantis and not talk about fascism. You can't look at Texas and think about, Abbott and his ilk and not think about fascism. And certainly you can't look at your home state, my dear, and think about Pence as the framed reasonable Republican and not think about the oncoming crisis of fascism in the United States. And I think we have too many of us mourning the mythology of an American dream that actually never really worked out for us because of racialized capitalism, which has always been in crisis for us, patriarchy, crisis of the climate and man-made climate disasters in the United States and abroad across the African diaspora. And you heard Reverend Barber also talk about health care. I think the intersection of all of those in black communities, particularly the disproportionate impact on black women in this country, is why there is an urgency of now.
Mark Morial, what is the urgency of now for you, sir?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to embrace and endorse what Reverend Barber said, because I think he framed it brilliantly. And the urgency of now is notwithstanding this long journey from some 60 years ago, the economic gap, the indicators on wealth and income and health remain as wide as they were back in the 1960s. And the National Urban League State of Black America Index points out that black people still are but 57% of what whites have when it comes to economic factors and considerations. But I would add this, Tavis. I think now we're also seeing a resurgent political movement from the right to normalize and mainstream white supremacy, white nationalism into an acceptable mainstream political movement. And it manifests itself in the vicious attacks on democracy, the vicious attacks on the truth about climate, the truth about reproductive rights, the truth about race in this country. And that movement is a clear and present danger to our agenda, and I think to the survival and the ability of this nation to thrive in the 21st century. The fierce urgency of now is the need for us to pick up every tool we have to fight back and to fight forward.
Each of you have said things that I want to unpack. I'm glad we have the hour because there's a lot to dig into. Reverend Barber, let me come back to you first. Your treatise on poverty is arresting for those who have not considered the facts that you laid out for us tonight. To what extent do you think that poverty is a threat to our very democracy?
I think it is a critical threat to our democracy. I think when you look at the 5 interlocking injustices that you can never separate, which is systemic racism, and when I say that, I mean by policy racism, that you can judge by not just somebody calling you the N-word or marching with a Klan flag, but actually policy racism where the person may never say anything racially with racial overtones, but the policies have disparate impact, and how that impacts black, white, brown, and even white and brown and Asian people. Systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. When you connect all of those, what we know is the same people, for instance, that let's take the voter suppression, who racially suppress the vote, they also vote against living wages, which, by the way, the vote that we took that was lost on living wages last year, it not only blocked 55 million Americans, but 43% of black folk from coming out of poverty and low wealth. That's a form of racism. Every morning, 4 million families get up every day, can buy unleaded gas, can't buy unleaded water. So poverty is contrary to the Constitution, which requires as the first premise that's just about a society where we have we don't have a lack of resources. That's a lie. The scarcity is a lie. We don't have a lack of ideas. We have a lack of consciousness and commitment to the kinds of policy change. You know, Tavis, when you think about it, everything I've mentioned and all those numbers could be changed by policy immediately. None of them are far out of our reach. So what we have is a direct threat, but I do want to add to something that my brother and my frat brother, my brother Ariel said. I don't think they're mainstream. I think it's been mainstream ever since Richard Nixon was advised by Kevin Phillips and Howard Dent and Pat Buchanan in 1968 for a strategy that was intended to last 60 years. And that strategy was positive polarization, using the animus against the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, divide the country intentionally, disavow whenever you get caught, but use that because what they said is that Dr. King had said the greatest fear of the aristocracy in this country was for the masses of Negro people and white people and Latino poor people to join together in a powerful bloc that could shift the economic architecture of the culture. And they said then, and it's been used all the way since then by every Republican and others forward, they would do everything they could to keep that coalition forever joining together. And so it must come together today because the very soul of the democracy is at stake. How can you, lastly, allow 250,000 people to die every year from poverty and low wealth? 7 people die from vaping, and you have a congressional hearing and White House hearings. 250,000 people die from poverty, and you can't get a damn peep hardly out of anybody about this. That's why we're mobilizing like never before, because poor people also have more power now. There's not one state in this country that's a battleground state where the voting population is less than 45% poor and low wealth. That's a factual reality, and we're going to turn that power from a negative to a positive.
I'm trying to bring us all together, and here at Reverend Barber is trying to start a fight. We ain't gonna have no black Panhellenic fight up in here tonight with you and Mark shouting each other out for being frat brothers. We ain't gonna do that tonight. I'm trying to bring us together. Mark Morial, let me come to you because Reverend Barber said something I think tees up something nicely for you to address. You mentioned earlier the state of Black America. You all, the Urban League, does this annual report. It's one of the most brilliant pieces of work that I've ever seen. Again, it comes out once a year, and I always wait to get my copy of it to see whether or not we've made progress or whether or not we're regressing. I'm not, Mark Morrall, naive in asking this question, but why is it in 2022 that black folks still lag far behind in every single leading economic indicator? Is it just racism?
So I think the analogy that I like to use is black folk, particularly when it comes to economics, are like the caboose on the train. And when you're the caboose on the train, it means even when the train speeds up, you remain in the caboose. When the train slows down, you remain in the caboose. And you cannot explain it in any other way than the overriding factor is the legacy of slavery and segregation, which baked in a series of hundreds of years of advantages based on skin tone being white and disadvantages based on skin tone being black. And the resistance to policy measures that would correct and ameliorate those long-standing differences. Right now, in the Supreme Court of the United States, the concept of affirmative action, a limited concept, that race can be a factor, even a minor factor in an admissions decision, let's call it for a more elite college or university, is under attack in the courts. It's under attack in the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court threatening to, in fact, completely shut it down. So the resistance in the 1960s to school integration, the concepts of white flight and redlining, Reverend Barber talked about that even in these times, the inability to move a living wage bill through the Congress of the United States and the failure of the Congress to even raise the old minimum wage in almost now 15-plus years is indicative of the resistance to the public policy changes that are needed. And so in the State of Black America report, over the years, we've seen minor improvements in, let's say, healthcare. When I say minor, they're not significant enough to close the gap by even 1/4, but they represent modest improvements, which are primarily driven by the expansion of Medicaid and elements of the Obama ACA bill. But all in all, as I've watched these numbers now very closely for 16, 17 years, the change has been infinitesimal in the relative social and economic conditions of blacks and whites. How can you explain it? You can't explain it other than it is a legacy of race and also the continued, if you will, resistance to ameliorating, to restorative policies, to policies that would repair that breach is still ever present in everything that we do. So we get a step forward here. We passed the child tax credit. The child tax credit was temporary. It is no longer on the books. The fight to make it permanent was quashed by those two Democrats in the United States Senate who refused to indeed go along. The same two who thwarted, if you will, an increase in the minimum wage to a living wage. So we, even when we get close to a policy shift that could be dramatic, we are indeed thwarted. So we have a tremendous amount of work to do, but I do not have despair. As a son of the South, I do not allow people to suggest that we are worse off than we were during segregation, because most people who say that never lived in segregation, like my parents and my grandparents. They never experienced the indignities of segregation and that period of time. So we shouldn't engage in that kind of conversation. What we should do is, I think, understand what history teaches, history tells us, and our history can energize our fight. Dr. King, Whitney Young, and others, the leaders of the 1960s, whether it was Malcolm and Stokely or whoever it was, they were operating in an environment where few, if any, black folk voted, where there were few, if any, black elected officials. Yet they stood up a movement that was both political and moral in its dimensions, and which made, importantly, public policy changes like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing laws, and the War on Poverty legislation.
You said a couple of things, Mark Morrell, that I want to come back to, but I want to get to Ashley back in this conversation, so I'm glad, again, we have this hour to unpack this. So, Ashley, before I ask you the question I want to ask, I wonder if you will share with the audience a bit of the history of the Highlander Center. I said earlier in introducing you that I celebrate you for keeping alive the grand tradition of this iconic institution called the Highlander Center, its connection to Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and so many others. So just give us a short history lesson about the Highlander Center, and then I've got a question I want to ask you.
Absolutely. I mean, the Highlander Center has been a school since 1932, so this is our 90th year, and we've been bringing people together across differences from all over the U.S. South and Appalachia and all over the country and internationally to come together to figure out how do we build a world that's really rooted in understanding that directly impacted people actually have the solutions to the problems that we face every day. So you mentioned some of the folks that have come through our doors, folks like Dr. King and Rosa Parks, who not only trained at Highlander before the Montgomery bus boycott, but went on to serve on our board of directors. We had staff like Septima Clark, the world's greatest teacher. We've hosted Dr. Barber, many of the 21st century's social justice warriors that are in the work right now. We train people from the time that they are born till the time they leave this plane. We believe in lifelong learning and movement accompaniment support, and we are still actively engaged in the fight to end the systems of oppression that harm us. So much so that white supremacists decided they were going to try to blow up my office back in 2019. So we are not only, practicing something that we value in terms of what it means to live social justice, but we're also dealing with the white supremacist blowback of what it means to do that work every day and continuing to do the work anyhow.
And she meant that seriously. In 2019, they firebombed the Highlander Center, and so this vicious assault on the institutions that have served us so well for all these years is still ongoing. But we celebrate the fact that Highlander, like a tree planted by the water, will not be moved, and 90 years later we celebrate their ongoing work and witness. The question I wanted to ask, Ashley, goes back to what you said earlier. You used the word fascism. You'll all recall that when President Biden uttered that word some weeks ago, all hell broke loose. And I raised that to ask Ashley whether or not you believe the country is prepared to have a conversation about fascism, because when the president said it again, all hell broke loose.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason that folks aren't having a more intellectually stimulating conversation about fascism, and even more importantly than that, a conversation about how to either stop it or to prepare to be in the 40 years in the wilderness that will come if we have to go into it, is because people don't know what fascism is in the first place, right? If we were just being honest, most folks don't know what fascism is, and I think that is a really, really important thing that folks left of Republican need to be paying attention to right now. Jairus Dixon, who is one of this century's most brilliant thinkers and doers, wrote an incredible article for Truth Out that talks about the fascist playbook. In fact, Jairus basically says that fascism isn't particularly creative. They just continue to use the same steps over and over and over again. There are 5 steps, basic steps to understand what fascism is. And I imagine that most of your listeners, once hearing it, will be like, oh, shoot, like I think I might live in a place that's already sort of teetering on the hills of fascism. So the first step is basically that the folks in power will use some sort of emergency to restrict civil liberties, right? They'll suspend institutions. They'll use that new power to be able to consolidate their own wealth and power, to reduce checks and balances, and to reduce access to elections and participatory governance. They'll promote fear and individual helplessness, particularly as it relates to their elected officials in the state, right? They'll replace democratic institutions with autocratic ones that basically, that just is fancy language for saying organizations and institutions that our people don't control. And then lastly, they'll create scapegoats to distract attention away from the failures of the state and the loss of civil liberties. So if you've heard anybody talking about how immigrants are coming for your jobs, or how those gay people are trying to kill your religion, or any sort of those things, it's creating scapegoats that actually are distracting us from talking about the fact that the state is actually wholesalely abandoned us. And now we're depending on nonprofit organizations to be the social safety net, mutual aid organizations to be the social safety net underneath us, when actually that's the role of the state. And so, when movement folks then come and talk about voting, it's like, well, we did that in 2020. We showed up in record numbers across demographics. We came and we risked our lives during a pandemic. And the least talked about thing is the white supremacist violence that many of us faced at the polls, whether it was folks driving their Confederate flags around, or literally shooting at polling precincts, threatening the lives of our poll workers, right? Like, all of these things were happening. We voted, and they still didn't pass the progressive policies that we need that would actually make it easier for us to participate in the voting process, like the John Lewis bill or freedom to vote, right? We couldn't even get them to do that. So I I definitely want to be clear. We have to understand the definition of fascism. We definitely have to get back out to the polls. And I know that many of you listening, like me, understand that there's only so many times we can tell you that it's going to be the most important election of your life.
Yes.
Right? But what I promise you is that there is a difference between the neoliberal government that we have now and a fascist one, right? There is a quantifiable difference between what we have currently and what we will have if the GOP wins this next presidential election.
Mark Morrell, let me circle back to you right quick. I'm looking at my clock. I got about 3 minutes, and we'll get to Reverend Barber on the other side. But let me ask you right quick, Mark, given what Ashley just laid out about all the trouble and travail that we are trying to traverse even in this present moment, you made the point earlier, Mark, that you don't, as a son of the South, want to accept the argument that we've not made progress. I hear that. On the other hand, sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, you don't ask the right question, you don't get the right answer. I find myself saying to people sometimes, Mark, that the question is not whether or not black folk are doing better today than we were a couple hundred years ago. Certainly we are. The question is, how are black folk doing today versus white folk today? And when I ask that question and go to the State of Black America report for an answer, it ain't looking so good, Mark Morrell.
It's stagnant. The disparities are indeed stagnant. There's no question about that. But I did want to add one element of fascism that has to be important. Mm-hmm. Fascism rejects that violence is inherently bad. Fascism embraces the fact that violence, political violence and war, are necessary needs to national rejuvenation and to an ideology and philosophy. And that is so crucial to understand. It's not just an ideology that says, let's promote it through utilization of the system. It is a far-right radical ideology which seeks to, if you will, endorse, promote the utilization of violence. And we witnessed this. We witnessed it in many instances, but the January 6th was a visible, organized effort, well-funded, well-financed to utilize violence to interrupt the processes of government. So I wanted to say that. I think that for black people in this country, the disparities are indeed real. But, Tavis, I have to hold on to some measure of hope and optimism if I am going to continue to fight. So if I'm going to continue to have the energy to be able to do what we are doing. And so let me give you an example of...
Mark Morrell, hold that thought. I want to hear that example, number one. Number two, I want to go back and forth, if we have to, on the difference between hope and optimism. They are not the same thing, as you well know. We'll unpack the distinct difference between those two things and get the example that Mark Morrell wants to give us when we come forward. You're listening to Agenda for America, an African-American perspective. Tonight's conversation is Why We Can't Wait, the Urgency of Now, with William Barber, Ashley Woodard Henderson, and Mark Morrell. I'm Tavis Smiley. Will continue when we come forward.
It's not a moment. It's a movement. We're still marching. KBLA Talk 1580. Unapologetically progressive. Power to the people.
So what you and I have got to do is get involved. In order to do this, we're starting a voters registration drive. It's going to be the ballot or the bullet. After we get our people registered, voting strength, and channel it in a direction that will get immediate results for the benefit of our people.
Malcolm X recognized the importance of the vote as a fundamental tool of black political power and civic engagement. Become part of the national movement to defend and help make our democracy a more perfect union. Let's use all the tools at our disposal. Register to vote and then cast your ballot on or by November 8th.
Paid for by the African American Voter Registration Education and Participation Project.
It's time to represent your neighborhood. It's time to be a voter. When you choose to be a voter, you get to decide what is best for you, your neighborhood, and your family. Use your power. Don't give it away. Have your families back and your neighborhoods back. To make a plan to vote today, visit plan.lavote.gov. That's plan.lavote.gov to get the info you need to vote in the upcoming November election. That's plan.lavote.gov.
Now arriving, the K. Metro's newest rail line connects communities like West Adams, the Crenshaw District, Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park, Inglewood, and more. Transfer easily to the E-line to connect to Santa Monica, Culver City, USC, and downtown. Ride the K to commute. 7 new K-Line stations now open. Learn about K-Line destinations, how to ride, and more at metro.net/K-Line. KBLA Talk 1580 is the official station of the K-Line.
Welcome back to Agenda for America, an African-American perspective. A national conversation presented by Smiley Audio Media Incorporated, KBLA Talk 1580, and executive produced by Tavis Smiley. Tonight's conversation is Why We Can't Wait, the urgency of now, and features an all-star panel, who we will rejoin in just a moment. The moderator this evening is Tavis Smiley, host of Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580. We hope you're enjoying Agenda for America, an African-American perspective, exclusively on KBLA Talk 1580. Here now, Tavis Smiley.
In the second hour of our conversation tonight, we'll be joined by Michael R. Dyson, Connie Rice, and Dr. Tyrone Howard. You do not want to miss hour 2, but we continue in this hour with 3 other brilliant minds: Mark Morial, president of the National Urban League; Ashley Woodard Henderson, co-director of the Highlander Center; and Nicole, convener of the Poor People's Movement, Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. Mark Morial, before I get to Reverend Barber, there was a point you wanted to make. Take it away, sir.
I think the point I want to make is, I've been reflecting a lot, Tavis, in the last few days on how things were 2 years ago, when 25 million people were out of work, when every school in America was closed, when COVID was taking away 4,500 lives per day, and how dark that time was in the nation. It was before Officer Chauvin was convicted of murdering George Floyd, before the other officers were convicted of a federal hate crime, before Ahmaud Arbery's killers were convicted. And I've been reflecting because I do believe it is important for us to recognize that notwithstanding long-term significant disparities, that I feel that compared to the dark time of 2 years ago, I feel the community is in a better place, not a perfect place, not exactly where we want to be, but it was so difficult if you were in an environment where friends and family members lost their lives, or where friends and family members were about to lose their homes. And so we've come out of such a difficult period, and now we're on this pathway. So what I am saying is that it is important to not have a long-term memory and short-term forgetfulness in terms of where we are as a nation, and whether public policy measures may have assisted that. I'm clear if Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark were not at the Department of Justice, those killers would never have been convicted of federal hate crimes. They would have never, ever been indicted or charged, indeed, with federal hate crimes. And one of the demands we had was for a Justice Department that endorsed and enforced the law. So I like to look at things, in a sense, by saying, let's look at the facts in terms of where we are. I am not happy, but I'll say this other thing. There was a misinterpretation of the 2020 election that simply because Democrats had 50 votes, that it represented a progressive win. There are, and we saw it with people like Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, and others within the Democratic coalition, there are people who are in no way progressive at all. They may be Democrats, they are not progressive. So the Democrats did not win a legislative majority in the 2020 election, although the headlines may have suggested that they won what I call an organizational majority, the ability to name the majority leader, but not the ability to pass the laws and the agenda that we all want.
No, I hear that. And there's nothing that you've said about the progress our people have made that I disagree with. But Reverend Barber, let me try this on you, because you are the Reverend on this panel tonight, and I think this will make sense to you. There's a distinct difference in my mind between optimism and hope. Optimism suggests that there's a particular set of facts, circumstances, conditions, something you can see, feel, or touch that gives you reason to believe that things are going to get better. That is not the experience of black folk in this country. Hope is something very different. You preach this stuff all the time, Reverend Barber. The Bible says that faith is what? The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I make that distinction because black folk, to me, have always lived on a street called a hope, not on a highway called optimism. So those are two different things to me. The question is whether or not in this present moment black people have anything that they can look at that gives us reason to be optimistic about the future.
Well, that is a heavy question, and I want to wrestle with it some because, sure, we always can have hope in the power of God. We can have hope in the power that we now have. As I said, 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country, 60.9% of them are black. That's despair, but the fact that we poor and low-wealth people make up 45% of the electorate in battleground states, and if we actualize that power, that could be hope. In some states like Florida, it would only take 4% of poor and low-wealth people that didn't vote in the last election to determine every electorate office in that state. 1% in Michigan, 19% in North Carolina, 4% in Pennsylvania. I could go on, but we really miss the point when we say whether things were better than they used to be. First of all, sure, slavery was zero. Living wage, minimum wage, or money. Took us 400 years to get to $7.25. But we can't wait another 400 years. That's gradualism. Yes. Gradualism is sin when it comes to justice. Dr. King said that the greatest enemies to the civil rights movement were moderates. That's what he said. The Pope is saying now that neoliberalism and trickle-down economics are the two great evils of forcing us not to address the issues that we should in the midst of all of this affluence. Now, I disagree with the Democrats didn't get a majority that it could work. But the question is, were they willing to fight for? Why is it that we couldn't have said, Mr. Manchin, you can get your infrastructure bill, but only when we pass the voting rights bill at the same time? If he held his one vote, why couldn't two other Democrats hold their one vote or their two votes? Why didn't we call Manchin and Sinema racist and classist when they voted to block 43% of black folk from being moved out of poverty to a living wage, and 55 million Americans? We also have to change the discussion. The discussion is about violence. It's about political violence. Sure, some people made it through COVID, but poor people died at a rate 2 to 5 times higher than anybody else. COVID didn't discriminate, but our policies did. We gave 6 to 8% of all the COVID money to businesses and corporations rather to the essential workers. We changed service workers' names to essential workers so that they had to go to work. But they didn't have to, but we didn't give them living wages, health care, and even real serious, complete forgiveness of evictions and on water bills. So you can't you can't go to them and say, but things are not as bad. I talked about Pamela, who died in Alabama because she did not have health care during COVID. She is a part of 330,000 people who are dead right now because even in the midst of COVID, America did not pass health care for all. I'm talking about the women, and she's black, I'm talking about the women in Appalachia who every Tuesday sell tacos on the side of the road so they can have enough money in a community fund to help other poor women during their menstrual cycles. I could go down the list of people, and what we have to then is not talk about is it a little bit better or this, but the level of political violence is gross, is sinful, is ugly, it does not have to be, and we are too comfortable about it. Some of our politicians are too comfortable about it, and how do you go through and get one vote on voting rights, one vote on living wages? We were told we couldn't pass any other legislation during the midterm, but you get the Inflation Reduction Act passed. But look at what we had to cut out, and that is not to discount the good stuff there. I get so tired of when you raise a legitimate criticism, folks say, "Well, you're not going with the game plan. You shouldn't be so critical." Listen, political violence. More black folk die from poverty than die at the hands of police. More black folk die from the lack of health care. When folk get shot because of police, we hit the streets. we move. We are going to have that same tenacity both in the streets and at the polls. And then finally, Tavis, this is not. It's not that these policies can't be passed. I'm not going to allow anybody to continue to excuse themselves when that we don't have a governing vote when we see extremists. Tell McConnell that. I bet you he didn't have but a little margin, but he blocked everything he could. He played hardball. And I'm saying to whoever it is, part of the reason this nation is not aroused as much as they should be is because we aren't using the language of arousal. What we should be saying is, it's a shame that we moved as far as we did through the second Reconstruction of Civil Rights Movement, and now we're going back to where we have the level of policy violence and death, and on top of that, we're spending 54 cents of every discretionary dollar on the war economy and less than 15 cents on infrastructure, education, health care, the things that could end the war on the poor. We've got to have a change in our conversation. And at last time, let me just say that I got to say this. One writer says this, that hope is not saying everything is fine. Hope is actually recognizing the suffering, acknowledging the suffering, and then being willing to get underneath the suffering and fight to change it. That's what hope is. Yeah. But you've got to own very seriously the suffering in all of its complexity.
We've raised King's name a number of times in this conversation tonight, and I'm thinking as Dr. Barber is talking about that triple threat that King talked about that was threatening our democracy then and still is today. Racism, poverty, and militarism. That is the triple threat that King warned of. Racism, poverty, and militarism. Speaking of poverty and economics, you heard Ashley, both Mark Morrell and Reverend Barber talk about economics. I want to ask you if you can unload for a second on what I see as the untapped power of black economic activism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it'll be a shock to anyone who knows me that I don't think black people will ever be free under an extractive economy like capitalism that literally has always existed to, extract wealth from black people, put it in the hands of a minority of white people to consolidate their power. But I do think that, again, this particular economy with this particular form of neoliberal government is better than fascism. It certainly is better than fascism. I believe that. And I believe in the faith that so many of our people have put their energies behind. The Fact of 15, you've heard Dr. Barber speak so brilliantly about the importance of passing living wage policies. And we know that that's happened in the South, right? We've seen Memphis and Shelby County pass living wage ordinances only for the right-wing trifecta of their state governments just to preempt it and say that wasn't enough, that they were going to get rid of those progressive policies that folks fought for on the local level. And what we know is that that's going to continue to happen until we figure out how to make sure that preemption is a thing of the past, a long memory away from the realities of today, because we could pass those on the state level and under a president like DeSantis, a president like Nikki Haley, a president like Pence, like Abbott, any of them, you call the roll, any one of them would preempt any positive legislation that we passed that benefited black people economically on the ground. I think what we've got to get really comfortable with is telling people the multiple truths that exist at the same time. I think Dr. Barber talked about this too, right? Is that, yes, there can be progress and people could still be in really crappy conditions. We need the Democrats to fight for us like our lives depend on it, because it actually does. And if we're going to center black economics in the conversation about what folks should be concerned about right now, it's not just because you want living wages in your job. That's true. You deserve that. But it's also because every other policy decision is going to impact the money in your pocket, right? If we've got to send black women 6 hours away from Tennessee to another state to get abortions, then guess what? That costs money. If in the state of Tennessee, where Highlander was born and raised, we had more black people in the state die of COVID than we had black population in the state, right? That cost money. The governor not expanding Medicaid closed hospitals. Doctors left the state. Folks were impacted because they had to drive from rural counties all the way to other major cities to be able to get basic urgent care needs met, right? All of these, every policy decision, ironically, is an economic one. And what the Democrats have power over in many, many cases, regardless of the fact that they don't have a progressive majority, is access to the budget, right?
Yeah.
And budgets are moral documents. If we are not passing budgets that are informed by the people's demands like the Vision for Black Lives, demands like the Poor People's Campaign's demands, and so many others, then frankly, it's a no-go to start, right? You just heard how much the January 6th uprising was well-funded, right? That's true, but the right has always been well-funded. They've been well-funded through individual donors. They've been funded by institutional philanthropy. They have an education program that's funded. We need that for the left, and I think that the end-all be-all for me is that if we funded the left like we wanted them to win, these economic concerns would be a foregone conclusion. We'd be done with it.
There again echoes of King that budgets are moral documents. Budgets are moral documents. Mark Morrell, the data that I'm reading suggests to me, and I'm reading some of the same stuff that you are. You're the president, so your stuff may be better than mine, president of the Urban League. But the stuff I'm reading, Mark, suggests to me, sadly, and I suspect our ancestors will turn over in their grave when they hear this, the data suggests to me that this generation of black youth, economically, will not do as well as their parents. We have finally arrived at a place in black history where we're making essentially a U-turn, that this generation of black youth are not expected to do as well economically as their parents. That's why kids go to school, go to college, and come right on back home living with their parents. They can't afford to buy a home, et cetera, et cetera. How should we process this data? How do we receive this? How do we wrestle with this data that this generation won't do as well as their parents, Mark?
It's not only troubling, it's angering that the generation of my children, I have a 40-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 16-year-old. Notwithstanding whatever I can provide to them, may not do as well as me or my parents economically. It remains to be seen, but in general, we are paying the price of economic policies that allowed manufacturing jobs to go offshore. We're paying the price for the failure to pass policies that promoted from not only a living wage, but the ability of people to organize and fight for better wages in the workplace. You know, the National Urban League grew up in the Midwest and the Northeast around manufacturing centers, Detroit, Toledo, Columbus, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, Chicago, where black people from the South with no college could work in a manufacturing plant, earn a better than a living wage, contribute to a retirement, have health care, and be protected for life. That social compact that existed has it has been fractured. So where are the people on the west side of Chicago who 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago worked in a manufacturing facility with a decent wage, bought a home, earned retirement, and had health care? They're now working in a service sector, minimum or low-wage job. It's not that they are less prepared, less qualified, less skilled. It's simply that the opportunities for them are no longer there. We allowed all these manufacturing jobs to go offshore to the point where 1/3 of all manufacturing in the world takes place in China, And these are policy choices that were made over a period from the 1970s all the way to the present. And we have to understand the role that policy plays. I think there's about the Democrats and what the Democrats should do. You know, I spent 20 years as an elected official, probably have less faith that, quote unquote, Democrats are going to do X, Y, or Z, simply because they have a D behind their name, and the dynamics of politics. And so we have to increase our participation in the system, and we have to encourage more people to run who share our vision and share our values. And we have to be active in off-cycle elections like the midterm elections. The Democrats, in the last, if you will, 40 years, since Reagan, have only had 3 2-year periods where they control the House, the Senate, and the White House simultaneously. And that is the 2 years at the beginning of Clinton, the 2 years at the beginning of Obama, and now the beginning of, if you will, Biden. Without that type of lineup where you have no opportunity whatsoever to even maximize your power to pass any modicum of any legislation that is on our agenda. So we are in a tough situation relative to this ability to pass, if you will, things in our agenda. But I will say, Ketanji Brown Jackson is on the Supreme Court. And we saw the difference she can make in oral argument her first week. And I got into a big debate with someone who said a Supreme Court justice is symbolic. Go tell that to Sam Alito. Go tell that to Amy Coney Barrett. Go tell that to the right-wingers who installed 3 of their judges. They certainly didn't think the Supreme Court was symbolic. It was realistic, and indeed it was real because it was a place to carry out their agenda. So my point is that we have to use every tool in the toolbox: organizing, voting, protesting where necessary, activism on all levels in order to be able to promote the type of change we need.
I'm wondering, Reverend Barber, I'm watching my clock here. We got about 8 minutes left in this conversation. I could do this for hours, and I will do it for another hour with another all-star panel in 8 minutes from now. But I'm wondering, Reverend Barber, as we talk about why we can't wait and the urgency of now, the fierce urgency of now, I'm wondering whether or not you think, as you move across this country organizing around the issue of poverty, that black people in particular, given all that we have been fighting for and fighting against, learning to love this country in spite of, not because of. I'm wondering whether or not you think black folk at this point just have fight fatigue.
I don't think so. I think, though, there is some fatigue we have. Remember, since we want to talk about why can't we wait and where do we go from here, remember Dr. King gave a scathing critique on black elected officials, too. And we don't want to talk about that.
That's true.
And sometimes it's not that you have the ability to win the vote. It's how you fight for the vote that then could encourage people to vote the next time. Too often what we have seen is, as I said, we've had 1 vote in 2 years on voting rights. And Manchin, for instance, signed on to the voting rights, the law that John Lewis wanted passed. He endorsed it while he was living. There is, and I could go on with that, but there's another sense. When we went to West Virginia, one of the things we said was there are 350,000 people in West Virginia who make less than a living wage. We said we must be organizing in that, and no organization should be standing down. We can't do all this in the back room. We've got to bring what Dr. King told us, and so many others. Frederick Douglass said it. He said when the abolition movement was attacked, it was monstrous, but we must embolden and intensify agitation. The only key to this is for poor and low-wealth black, brown, white, Asian people to come together. Some of us as black have got to stop saying white poor people vote against their own interests. The data doesn't say that. It says that when poor and low-wealth white people vote and others, they tend to vote progressive, at least in the majority. 53% of all poor people voted for the Biden-Harris ticket. We have to mobilize this powerful, as I said, block of voters. We have to talk about it. We have to also, when we talk about a black agenda, not let people just drive us down to talking about voting rights. Labor rights is a black agenda. Living wages is a black agenda. We need to have one band, one sound on that. Health care is a black agenda. But we also must talk about the interlocking injustices and evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, the false moral narrative, religious nationalism, and declare that those interlocking injustices require an intersectional moral fusion. I want to be clear up here. I'm not talking about pushing just Democrats, Republicans. I'm talking about pushing America, the soul of America. We did a study called The Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. When we did that study, we had even black congresspeople telling telling us there were only 39 million poor and low-wealth people. But when we did that study and worked with Columbia University and Howard and others, we found out it was 140 million poor and low-wealth people, 60.9% of black people. We are going to have to start using that data and using that language and making our demands and our voice sound like the pain that people are in. And then lastly, we have the power in this organization. I don't want us to miss where we are. And that is, in North Carolina, as I said, it's 19% of the 1 million poor low-wealth voters that didn't vote the last time. That could change every race. Yeah. Florida is 4%. Georgia is 7%. Michigan is 1%. And we have a power that is yet untapped, and we must unleash it.
I hear you. I've got a minute, literally 1 minute for each of you to wrap this conversation. I want to close with another Kingian question. And that question, Ashley Woodard Henderson, is where do we go from here? And you got 60 seconds to give it to me.
I think we mourn the dead and we fight like hell for the living. I think that what we need to recognize is that part of this white supremacist political violence that we're facing right now is a backlash because we showed up and showed out in 2020, and we need to keep the pressure on.
Mark Morial, where do we go from here, sir?
As my predecessor, the late Eugene Kinkle-Jones, one of the 7 Jews of Alpha Phi Alpha, said, "We fight till hell freezes over, then we fight on the ice."
I love that line. He was an alpha, but I still love that line. As I said, we ain't having no Panhellenic fight today. But that is a cold line. We fight until hell freezes over, and when hell freezes over, we're gonna fight on the ice. I love it. Reverend Barber, where do we go from here, sir?
I think we say forward together, not one step back. We mobilize around these 5 interlocking injustices. We recognize our power, don't back up, and we take a line from the scriptures, Hebrews chapter 10. We are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. We can not only fight, but we must fight and win, and know the only wins we ever got was when we chose to fight and to challenge America's soul at its core.
Let me squeeze out a few more seconds. Mark, we're just days away now from the midterm elections. How you feeling?
If I use my barometer being in Atlanta and Columbus and Durham over the weekend and in Philadelphia tonight, there's a tremendous amount of energy in the community. So I feel optimistic. What I am campaigning for is for us to do our job and turn out to vote. Yeah. And I think we will. I think we will in large numbers. I think we've got a lot of work to do in order to do it. So I'm hopeful, and yes, I am optimistic. But these are precarious times, and I am prepared for whatever the eventuality comes.
In 30 seconds, Reverend Barber, do you think that on the other side of the midterms that we can get poverty raised up higher on the American agenda?
Well, 150,000 people came to the Capitol on June 18th for mass poor people, low-wage workers, a mass assembly, and march to the polls. Tuesday, we will touch 5.1 million voters, poor and low-wealth, low-propensity voters who tend to vote progressive. We are saying we're going to vote for not as support, but as demand. After the vote, we're going to keep the pressure on, and if that pressure means everything from pushing and marching and standing and voting and even massive nonviolent civil disobedience. But what we cannot do any longer is allow the 140 million poor and low-wealth people and their critical issues to be unaddressed in this nation.
I thank the Reverend William J. Barber II. I thank Ashley Woodard Henderson. I thank Mark Morial for being a part of this rich dialogue in Hour 1. We're just getting started. Hour 2 is around the corner with Michael Eric Dyson, Connie Rice, and Tyrone Howard. This is Agenda for America, an African-American perspective, why we can't wait, the urgency of now.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
Power to the people. Let us march on ballot boxes. The men and women will no longer walk the streets in search for jobs that do not exist. Let us march on ballot boxes until brotherhood is more than a meaningless word at the end of a prayer. The first order of business on every legislative agenda. Let us march on ballot boxes until every valley shall be exalted, until every mountain and hill shall be made low, until the rough places are made plain, and the crooked places straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. Let us march on ballot boxes until we are able to send to the state houses men who will do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with their God.
Paid for by the African American Voter Registration, Education, and Participation Project.
It's time to represent your neighborhood. It's time to be a voter. When you choose to be a voter, you get to decide what is best for you, your neighborhood, and your family. Use your power. Don't give it away. Have your families back and your neighborhoods back. And make a plan to vote today. Visit plan.lavote.gov. That's plan.lavote.gov to get the info you need to vote in the upcoming November election. That's plan.lavote.gov.
Now arriving, the K. Metro's newest rail line connects communities like West Adams, the Crenshaw District, Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park, easily to the E-line to connect to Santa Monica, Culver City, USC, and downtown. Ride the K to comfort food, culture, and an improved commute. 7 new K-line stations now open. Learn about K-line destinations, how to ride, and more at metro.net/K-line. KBLA Talk 1580 is the official station of the K-line.
Welcome to Agenda for America, an African American perspective, a national conversation presented by Smiley Audio Media Incorporated, KBLA Talk 1580, and executive produced by Tavis Smiley. Tonight's conversation is Why We Can't Wait, the urgency of now, and features an all-star panel who you will meet in just a moment. The moderator this evening is Tavis Smiley, host of Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580. We hope you're enjoying Agenda for America, an African American perspective, exclusively on KBLA Talk 1580. Here now, Tavis Smiley, Tavis Smiley, Tavis Smiley.
That first hour was rich and it was fire, but we're going to take another notch. Take it up another notch in this second hour of this conversation. Agenda for America, an African American perspective. Why we can't wait, the urgency of now. We thank Mark Morial, we thank Reverend William J. Barber, and we thank Ashley Woodard Henderson again for that amazing dialogue in hour one. But it's on and popping now. As I told you earlier, you might want to get your thesaurus. Michael Eric Dyson's in the house. And so I warned you, Tyrone Howard is here from UCLA, and Connie Rice joins me here in studio. As I said also earlier, I wanted Dr. Tyrone Howard here because I get tired of my friends on the East Coast, Connie, who think that all the smart Negroes are on the Eastern Seaboard. So, no, we got some smart Negroes on the West Coast, too. And so, Connie Rice, I am delighted to have you in studio. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Tavis.
Dr. Tyrone Howard, UCLA education professor, how are you, sir?
Doing well, brother. How you doing, Tavis?
If I complained, I'd be an ingrate. Glad to have you with us. And the M to the E to the D. Michael Eric Dyson, how are you, sir?
I showed up at Skechers this morning, but they wouldn't let me in.
You're killing me. You're killing me. Dr. Dyson is a professor at Vanderbilt and my dear friend and brother, and I'm glad to have him in this conversation as well. Let me start this hour the same place we started the first hour. We got a whole lot to unpack this, and I'm glad, just delighted to have you all three of you in this conversation. Connie, it's the urgency of now we're talking about tonight. To your mind, what is the urgency of right now?
Understanding what we're facing. Mm-hmm. Because I think we're in the wrong frame. The civil rights era, we're watching the end of its unwinding. Mm-hmm. We're looking at crises that I don't think we see are coming. We keep looking at an elephant in the corner when we've got a velociraptor next to it. You better look at the velociraptor. We need to wake up and smell the bear spray and understand the nature of the threat. The threat has changed. It's bigger, and it's more apocalyptic. We've got a short-term strategy of just trying to hold on to what I call the democracy project, because we've never had a democracy. We just had a framework within which to try to move forward toward a democratic framework. But we've never had a democracy. But even that pathway, that constitutional framework, is about to end. And it could end in this next election. So that's a very short term. We've got to fight for that because, as Ashley said, an hour ago, you think it's hard to fight to defend African American interests now inside of this potential democracy? Try it in an autocracy or a fascist, white nationalist, Christian nationalist, demagogue-run entity. You can forget it. We'll all be in boxcars on the way to Manzanar too. So there's a short-term battle. There's a medium-term battle of if we do survive, then the agendas that Dr. Barber was talking about, the grand alliance that he is putting. Dr. King's grand alliance was poor whites and poor blacks, poor peoples. The folks that Dr. King said they will be obsolete. The Negroes will be obsolete. Poor white people will be obsolete if they don't band together and demand from this capitalist system an agenda that actually gives them a ladder up. Then they will perish. I don't know if the politics of the Grand Alliance are possible now during this huge backlash and this huge race war that's folks are trying to gin up. But if it is possible, that's what I mean by assessing where are we really, what frame are we in. Long term, Tavis, I'm looking at climate change. I can't keep my eye off climate change. If you think the problems we're talking about now, they won't even be talked about if we don't stop the destruction of our climate. Climate chaos could wipe out entire civilizations. And so if we don't get a handle on that level of threat and don't understand that we have basically 20 years to get the international order to respond to it. Because just think about this. Will become uninhabitable. You can't live in 130 degrees of heat. You think they're worried about a few Latinos and Venezuelans and Guatemalans fleeing violence coming over. Everybody's going to be knocking on the borders of Canada to try to get into livable, habitable land. So I look at it as three tiers. And what I'm afraid of is that we're talking about a framework that was operable 35 years ago, 50 years ago. And what we've done for the last 60 years is engineer downward mobility, the unraveling of the civil rights framework. We didn't even get a foothold on that, and they started undoing it. And we don't understand what's needed to fight these fights. The Democrats will be 2 years too late. It's in the next 2 weeks. The youth vote can save us because it was a youth vote of color that actually elected Biden. If our young people don't get to the polls and they know their future, I'm going to be dead by the time this stuff ends. But anyway, I want us, the urgency of now is understanding the fight. You have to know what kind of battle you're in.
And we're in the wrong frame.
We're in the wrong frame.
All right, I get it. Dr. Tyrone Howard, sir, what is the urgency of now as you see it?
Wow, I think Connie Rice said it so eloquently. I think the urgency of now is understanding what we're up against. And as the saying goes, we oftentimes are playing against folks who are playing chess, and we're not even playing checkers. We're playing jacks. We're not even in the game yet. And so we've got to understand that the legacy of white supremacy is real. It manifests itself in all types of policies, all types of laws, all types of legislation in ways that we don't recognize it. We also have to understand the depths of anti-blackness, which is at the foundation of what white supremacy is all about. And part of the challenge is, Tavis, is that the urgency is now that we've got to understand, as Brother Malcolm said, that education is a passport to the future. But tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today, and we are not prepared for it. We are not prepared for it because in so many ways we don't seem to understand the ways in which we have an economy, we have a political machine, we have a social fabric that are all decaying. So at some point in time, I think we as a nation have to ask ourselves the fundamental question, where is our moral compass? That's what the urgency of now is, because when we allow millions of folks to be unhoused in this country, millions of folks to go without basic needs such as food and water on a day-in-day basis, most of them who, by the way, disproportionately happen to be black folk, we have to say, why do we allow and how can we allow so many people to go without basic needs under what is supposedly a democratic society? So in our quest to push this to be a more perfect union, which we have always been the soul of this nation, black folk have been, we have to sort of galvanize our political might, galvanize our political will to force this country to be who it says she is. And I think that until we begin to do that, it will never reach that. And I think at the end of the day, the urgency of now is when you allow your most vulnerable, yet who are your most morally the judicious folks on the planet in this country to be looked at as being less than, overlooked, and underserved, you've got a problem. So at the end of the day, I think about Gunnar Myrdal, who talked about the American dilemma. America has to ask itself a question. It can't hold up these ideals of freedom, democracy, justice, egalitarianism, but at the same time, when you look at the basic, decent human rights and civil rights that are denied to folks in this country, say you're that shining city on the hill, because we are far from it. We got to recognize that, and it takes black folk waking up to recognize that. I'm always reminded of what Harriet Tubman said. She said she freed hundreds of black folks, but she would have freed hundreds and hundreds more if they had known they were enslaved. We're in that same moment today.
MED, what is the urgency of now? If you want to, I'll take it in your king voice.
Now, Tavis, I've been out here meditating upon the improbable outcome of this ingenious woman and this incredible man. I was telling Ralph the other day, if we don't get more fish sandwiches down here, we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves to talk to the people.
You kill me, man. You kill me. I love it.
To keep up with Kanye. I can't even keep up. I turn around and I can't even ask little baby what's going on. Doc, well, you've had these incredible powerhouses answer. I mean, I'm just refreshed and reminded of the extraordinary eloquence of Attorney Rice and her capacity to just thumbnail and sketch in full sweep what we're facing, and Dr. Howard so poignantly, pointing to the existential crisis we confront. I guess I would echo and amplify what they're saying. We thought we were dealing with democracy, but what we've got to understand is that black people have always been the translation of the true meaning of democracy to America. And we should have known already that America doesn't love democracy because it doesn't love us. And when it doesn't love us, it doesn't love the possibility of what its ideals, goals, and noble aspirations have been expressed and articulated in its foundational documents. If we are the translation of their hopes and aspirations, they don't want to see that or hear that translation in our black skin, in our demand that we be heard. So when we talk constantly about black women being the salvation of democracy, and they are, not only in terms of voting, but in terms of mobilizing a machinery of at once exacting compassion and insistent stress upon the foundational elements of a true democracy, education, commitment to the poor, an accessible way of understanding the economy that they confront, and ways they're able to translate education into real gains for ordinary people. So I think that, look, January 6th proved to us America ain't interested in Blue Lives Matter because they beat up on the police. They're not interested in the institutions of American society because they ransacked it. They pillaged and plundered the very foundation of American democracy, its symbolic articulation, in the Capitol. So what we saw was not merely what happened in the Confederacy, which is a dishonorable disregard for the unity of the nation. It was also the attempt to repudiate the very ideals and norms upon which this government rests. The American dilemma rests upon the fact that there's a huge gulf between the noble aspirations America expresses and its failure to reach up to them. Now they don't even pretend, they don't even fake that these are the goals. It is naked power. It is the unmitigated ability to exercise control over the lives of the most vulnerable. And we are given Attorney Rice's notions of those three different elements, the immediate, the short range, the middle range, and the long range. Well, we got to have Steph Curry on the outside shooting it from the from the darn logo, and we got to have Giannis Antetokounmpo on the inside stuffing the ball. So we got to have an inside-outside game, which is the genius of a Martin Luther King Jr., to understand that you got to protest from outside, and then you've got to situate people from within to make a difference. We can't give up on this nation and these institutions because we helped build them. And the fact that we've helped build them means that they don't have internal obsolescence at their heart. You know, so much of stuff is produced now with the belief the iPhone, it'll be done in a year, it'll be done in 2 years, we'll need something else. Well, what we did is built this democracy to last, and it has outlasted the infamous folly of white supremacy and the logic of self-destruction that undergirds the American economy and the American democracy. Black people bringing full sense to this situation is the only hope for salvation.
You said so much already, all three of you, that I want to unpack. Let me go to Tyrone Howard right quick. Dr. Howard, you used the phrase first tonight, anti-blackness. As I think about it, America has always had an anti-black agenda. That's how it was founded, right? But what do you make of this particular moment of anti-blackness that we're trying to navigate our way through?
Yeah, you're right, Tavis, that America has had a love affair with anti-blackness. And I think what they've done with it is they have allowed other folks to begin to subscribe to its tenets. So in this moment, you have a Kanye West. You have a Candace Owens who become talking heads who are put on a pedestal to essentially blame black folks for the problems that America has created. But I think that there are also more subtle forms of anti-blackness that manifest itself. When you look at what William Barber talked about a moment ago about the ways in which we see poverty is entrenched in this country, but largely poverty is a black issue. You look at the Voting Rights Act, we're talking about the removal of voting restriction largely in black communities. You talk about the economic gaps that exist in this country today. Those are largely affecting disproportionately black folks. So part of what anti-blackness is, it's not somebody floating out the N-word at me. It's not somebody any other kind of disparaging word. It's the systemic nature in which we see policies, in which we see legislation that has been enacted for centuries in this country that denies black folks basic pathways to what we call ideal opportunities to be self-actualized. That's the 21st century form of anti-blackness.
Yeah. His name has come up 2 or 3 times already. Let me just go straight there and we'll move on. I'll get back to Kanye in a second here. So Dyson, are we giving up on Kanye yet? How are you reading this particular Kanye moment?
Well, it's tragic. It's sad to see the performance of black self-destruction on a public, on a public stage, and the refusal of Kanye. Now we can look. Let's already acknowledge that there's a mental health element. All right, we can acknowledge that.
Absolutely,
acknowledge that, right? Right, and it is important to do that because we just think all you need is Jesus. No, Negro, you need some chemicals and some intervention. That's what Jesus said. This kind could not come out through prayer and fasting. Negro, you need, some serious chemical intervention. Thou needest Prozac. So the point is, of course, that we not only see the performance of the refusal of black people to acknowledge the centrality of therapy, right? We find therapy in compensatory mechanisms, in drugs and sex and, all kinds of ways, as opposed to going to the heart of the matter and sitting down with somebody and talking and having a conversation that might help bridge the gulf between our sanity and our survival. But with Kanye, beyond that, I think what we see is, the rashness and the arrogance the brashness that was so attractive to us was destructive to him. Kanye goes from $1.9 billion to $400 million. Now, to the rest of us, $400 million is a lot of money. But what did Chris Rock say? If Bill Gates wakes up tomorrow morning with Oprah's money, he's going to jump out the window.
That's right.
So it's all relative at that level, right? On the same day that Elon Musk is taking over Twitter and firing people, buying it for what, 40, 50, 60 billion dollars, that's real capital in cash. Kanye felt that he was that he was untouchable because he had bully pulpit carved out of his indestructible financial integrity, and yet it was a house of cards. Because at the end of the day, you didn't liquefy that cash. What you have at hand isn't going to be able to sustain the dreams and aspirations you have. You're buying Parler, and Elon Musk is buying Twitter. So what you understand, therefore, is that the contrast between those forms of wealth, what they now call racial capitalism, is extremely important. But at the end of the day, you can't fall upon your blackness to justify and legitimate, anti-Semitism, or, on the other hand, the kind of anti-blackness that Dr. Howard was talking about, the internalized self-abnegation that is the most thorough index of white supremacies occupying our brains. And in Kanye's case, it's white supremacy by ventriloquism. A black mouth moving white ideas using the runway of his tongue to launch episodes of self-hatred that have been performative to the nth degree. So I pray for him. I listen to his music, and it's getting harder to do that. And it's harder because, at the end of the day, as I end here, it's harder because, as John Legend told me, Kanye never hung out with me and talked about politics, even when he was making all those records, talking about going to, as a child, going on the protest line and the picket line with his parents, mother and father. He said that stuff was in his music, but it was never a source of conversation for Kanye. So here we have projected onto him our political ideals, and at the end of the day, Kanye is about fashion and is about maintaining a certain kind of projected persona as the basis of his mythology. And now the self-mythology has to give way to existential dread and empirical displacement.
The other issue, this Kanye matter, this particular episode, Kanye, that he's having right now, the other issue that it raises, as Dyson just put his finger on, is the issue of anti-Semitism. We have our own struggles and our own fights that we have to navigate through as black people, and from time to time we get put upon to distance ourselves from others who make comments that the particular community we're talking about, the Jewish community, finds to be anti-Semitic. Talk to me briefly, we'll get back on track here, about black folk and anti-Semitism.
Well, I always say the United States is the Baskin-Robbins of anti-blackness. If I meet somebody, it's not a question of whether you're anti-black, it's what kind of anti-blackness do you have.
What flavor,
what flavor, which flavor.
I got you.
Same thing for anti-Semitism. And I have to know what kind of anti-Semitism, but it's as prevalent. You go globally, it's everywhere. You go globally, there's anti-black, anti-African Americanness, because you'll even find folks from the Caribbean and folks from African countries making sure they distinguish themselves. We're not black Americans. So it's one of America's biggest exports. So anti-Semitism is global. A global kind of hatred and fear. So in every community, you're going to have different flavors of anti-blackness, and you're going to have the anti-Semitism. You're going to have the homophobia. Every single community has these isms and phobias, and so we all need to acknowledge that. And we need to stand up to it. Now, you know that when we're at the family, I can remember my uncles talking about Puerto Ricans, and I was the one at the table that would say, no, we don't do that, and everybody else would, that's why they'd send me in the kitchen to eat. But everybody, we all struggle with this. So the anti-Semitism, no. I brook none of it. None of it. You talk that way, I will shut you down. And I do get into debates with people. And every community, I acknowledge every community has anti-blackness. That does not license me to have the same views. So, but the corruption of celebrity is one of the corrupting dynamics that we're dealing with. Without The Apprentice, whatever that show was, we wouldn't have had, Orange Jesus destroying the democracy. And it's at a religious level now. I mean, that's why we can't really combat it. But getting away from Kanye for a second, because it's I don't know how much, one deluded individual that needs mental health care can set the table for what we're talking about. It's more of a distraction in my mind, but sad. As Michael says, but I do what the conversation is making me think. It's making me think about the power to challenge the systems through voting. That's a systemic. We're trying to impact the meta dynamics that are destroying the framework that we have been familiar with. At the individual level, we've never realized our power. I'll never forget Harry Belafonte telling he was up at Jim Brown's house, and we'd all been at the prisons together. And Harry came back furious. He had seen bunk beds stacked 4 levels high with black bodies in them. And he came back, and we were in a room full of Crips and Bloods with Jim Brown and Harry there. And Harry was shaking with rage, and he looked at these guys, and he said, "How dare you? How dare you give your black bodies back into chains? We have spent 300 years fighting to break our chains, and you give this system what it needs to lock you up." And first of all, I was looking for the exits because I didn't know how the guys were going to respond.
I bet.
You know, I said, okay, can I get him out of here? But let me tell you something. Bo Taylor stood up in silent recognition of respect for what he was saying. And the whole room stood up, of these powerful African-American men who were gang interventionists, who were going into the prisons to try and get folks to think differently about themselves and the damage they had done, and to come out and become men to actually help the community heal. I mean, this is a very powerful group, the American group, other African-American interventionists, and what Harry was telling them was that they had the personal power to actually shut down the mass incarceration, new Jim Crow machinery. Because all we had to do was organize those men to understand. All we had to do was say, you don't get our criminality. We're not going to walk on that IED and let it blow up. Organize the entire community so that they had no pretext for mass stops, mass roundups, and it made me think we haven't even begun to mine that level of power, just our individual power. Now, our systemic organizational responses, they're too anemic right now to meet the challenge, is what we were talking about when you first asked us the urgency of now. So and I think that what Michael's talking about is understanding that at these multiple levels, we haven't even begun to tap our power. And in order to understand the fight that we're in.
Tyrone Howard, let me come back to you. I'm looking at my clock here. I've got to step aside in about 2 minutes. Let's get this thing started. We'll continue on the other side. But I'm thinking, as Connie's talking now about the issue you raised earlier of having lost our moral compass. Have we lost our way?
No, I don't think we've lost our way. I think we live in a society that had never found its way. And I think we have been the arbiters of justice. We have been the arbiters of morality. But I think the challenge here is, Tavis, is if we're clear about not losing our way, we got to understand the ecosystem in which we operate and what it does to us. So I want to build on Brother Dyson's point. I think he's spot on. I mean, the situation with Kanye is tragic, but we still must wrap our arms around that brother, and we must still love him, because what Kanye's situation is showing to us is that America in the depths of white supremacy can literally make you lose your mind. We see Kanye's on the public display, but when you really get down to it, we got Uncle Joe in our family who was having issues a long time ago, and we just didn't know what to call it. We got Aunt Will who had some issues. We just didn't know, what the name of it was. We have to have these conversations around mental health in black communities. We have to be beginning to recognize that when you deal with the effects of racism every day, there's study after study that shows that the epidemiology of what it does to us literally kills us, or it literally causes us to lose our minds in the process. So we look at Kanye and we criticize him. We look at Kanye and we kind of keep him at arm's length. I'm asking us as black folk to begin to think different about how we pull those folks in, because that could be us next month. That could be us next week, because we have continued to fight through every fiber of our being just to maintain our humanity in such a way that says that we want to be the arbiters of justice. You can't treat black folk in a way that you don't treat other folks. You can't talk to black folk in ways you talk to other folks. So no, we have not lost our way. We have always been the people who tried to get America to be what it says it is. And when it's not what it says it is, we are the ones who get demonized and told that we are the problem. We must remind ourselves we are not the problem. We are the source of salvation. We are the anchors of justice, and we are the arbiters of love that has always tried this country to be the best that it has to be, even though it continues to kick us in the face.
When we come forward, I'm coming right back to that point and going straight to Michael Eric Dyson, because it seems to me that what Dr. Tyrone Howard is teeing up for us is that we're in a moment right now where we are seeing white supremacy normalized in our politics, in our civic engagement, but we're seeing the normalization of white supremacy as a word. We'll come back to that point with Michael Eric Dyson, and of course continue to talk to Connie Rice and Dr. Tyrone Howard. I am Tavis Smiley. You're listening to Agenda for America, an African American perspective. Why we can't wait. The urgency of now will continue when we come forward.
It's not a moment. It's a movement. We're still marching. KBLA Talk 1580. Unapologetically progressive.
Power to the people. If Black Lives Matter, make black votes count. Vote by November 8th. Long lines. Voter roll purges. Voter identification laws. Voter intimidation. Felony disenfranchisement. Polling place closures. Early voting limitations. Partisan redistricting. Partisan Supreme Court rulings. Invalidation of the Voting Rights Act. Vote on or by November 8th. If Black Lives Matter, make black votes count. Tamir Rice, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Heather Heyer, Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Fred Hampton, Werner, Goodman, and Cheney, Viola Louisu, Fannie Lou Hamer, John Lewis. They rest in power. Make their memory in power when you vote on or by November 8th. Black votes count.
Paid for by the African American Voter Registration, Education, and Participation Project.
It's time to represent your neighborhood. It's time to be a voter. When you choose to be a voter, you get to decide what is best for you, your neighborhood, and your family. Use your power. Don't give it away. Have your families back and your neighborhoods back. Now make a plan to vote today. Visit plan.lavote.gov. That's plan.lavote.gov to get the info you need to vote in the upcoming November election. That's plan.lavote.gov.
Now arriving, the K. Metro's newest rail line connects communities like West Adams, the Crenshaw District, Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park, Inglewood, and more. Transfer easily to the E-line to connect to Santa Monica, Culver City, USC, and downtown. Ride the K to comfort food, culture, and an improved commute. 7 new K-line stations now open. Learn about K-line destinations, how to ride, and more at metro.net/K-line. KBLA Talk 1580 is the official station of the K-line.
Welcome back to Agenda for America, an African American perspective, a national conversation presented by Smiley Audio Media Incorporated, KBLA Talk 1580, and executive produced by Tavis Smiley. Tonight's conversation is Why We Can't Wait, the urgency of now, and features an all-star panel, who we will rejoin in just a moment. The moderator this evening is Tavis Smiley, host of Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580. We hope you're enjoying Agenda for America. Exclusively on KBLA Talk 1580. Here now, Tavis Smiley.
She is Connie Rice, towering public intellectual, brilliant civil rights lawyer. He is Dr. Tyrone Howard, professor in education at UCLA. And he is Michael Eric Dyson, professor at Vanderbilt, and just brilliant all-around thinker. Dr. Dyson, I was saying a moment ago that we're in a moment, if I can pick up on the point that Dr. Howard made, where, to my mind at least, we're seeing white supremacy, which has always been as real as rain, but it's being mainstreamed and normalized in so many ways. That's my read. What's yours?
No, it's absolutely right. If you look at the greatest indicator for fascism in America, it's always been white supremacy. We could have told Lynn Cheney and Benny Thompson and those good people on that committee that we knew it was ramping up because they tried it out on us first, right? So when you're holding people on, slave plantations, when you're holding them in urban situations, when you're denying them access to the franchise, when you're deliberately imprisoning them, when you're denying them freedom of speech, when the Supreme Court rules in 1857 that black folk have no rights that white folk are bound to respect, that's fascism, writ small, against the canopy of black struggle. Then you put that on to the American scene. The reason black folk are most especially capable of addressing this hour is because we have been confronting the stratagems of white supremacy from the giddy up. It was Fannie Lou Hamer who said, the mistake white folk made was that they put us behind them instead of in front of them. And when they put us behind them, we had to learn everything about their culture in order for our survival to take place. They know nothing about us. We know everything about them. So the experts of white supremacy, that's why Malcolm X is talking about the end of worldwide white supremacy. Been the predicate for American democracy, what they call in logic the suppressed premise. It ain't the obvious one that's the basis of your existence. It's the one that you overlook because you didn't even know it was there. White supremacy has been a real thing to us from the giddy up. And yes, they have normalized it. They have made it accessible. They have made it even sexy. Young white boys in coiffed hair saying to Jews and black people, you will not replace us. They have been radicalized into a kind of racial terror on the internet so that the dispersed, diffuse methods of recruitment make it very difficult for us to contain the metastasization of white supremacy across the body politic. But again, who you going to call Ghostbusters? The fact is black people have been majoring in white supremacy from the get-go. So I hope some of that government money can go to Negroes on the corner who've been saying, I've been dealing with them from the get-go. Let me tell you what to do. And then to give some kind of grassroots ethnography of white supremacist behavior. That's why even in schools, when I teach my classes and the young people are there and white folk are just getting mad. They're just not getting mad. Oh, my God, Jiminy Cricket, I can't believe my parents didn't tell me about this stuff going on. I can't believe it. So we said, calm yourself, son. We've been at this for about 400 years. Let me give you some answers and some hookups about what to do.
Yeah. Connie, it is true, I believe at least, that black folk have always been the conscience of this country. But our democracy is in peril, and you and I, if I could get it out, have had any number of conversations about that reality, about the the fragility of our democracy. The question I've never had a chance to ask you, which I want to pose right now, is what responsibility do black people in particular have in this moment in late modernity to help save this democracy, or should we just let it burn?
Well, I don't think it's a responsibility, Tavis. I think it's a strategy to survive.
Okay.
We can barely survive on a promise, a pathway to achieve democracy. We've been achieving America. The promise of America. We've never had it. We have never lived in freedom. I was trying to explain to some white friends of mine. I said, political correctness, you think that you're being canceled? I said, we were born canceled. We have never been able to say what we need to say, because if we say one thing that makes white people uncomfortable, we lose a job, we lose status, we lose our place in line. We have never been free to say anything we want. We have to constantly, every day, compensate for the racial hierarchy, for the hegemony and the control of other groups over us. It's both the racial domination, which was built into the dark bargains of the United States Constitution. We started as a slaveocracy.
That's right.
If you study slavery, it takes a minimum of 700 years to come out of the shadow of any society that is imbued with slavery. And so we're not even, Mississippi didn't agree to end slavery until 1996. That's when they voted to approve of the 13th Amendment. 1996. Okay, took them. I guess they were waiting for reimbursement for their slaves. Who knows? But on top of that, Tavis, I don't know that we have a responsibility, but I think it's our only hope of keeping as anemic and frustrating and incremental as that pathway was. Because of the multiracial coalitions, because the slaves freed themselves, and Lincoln was forced to free the D.C. slaves for the first Emancipation Proclamation. Second Emancipation Proclamation was to free the slaves so they could join in the rebellion states, so that they could join the Union. And that's what, without those 40,000 freed slaves joining the Union, the South would have won. So, all of that history, we didn't do it because it was our responsibility. We did it because it was the only way we could survive. On top of that, I would just add, it's not just the racial hegemony and toxicity and white lash, the backlash, the unraveling of just the very incremental improvements that the civil rights framework gave us. Those are over. They've been dismantling them as soon as they were passed. As soon as the Voting Rights Act was passed, they started the Southern strategy. Whites left and went to the Republican Party. I mean, we could see step by step by step. And now the Supreme Court has been radicalized. It's over. But on top of that, there's also the patriarchal suppression. This is toxic masculinity on steroids, on Viagra. Okay, and you look at the control of women's bodies through that Supreme Court case Dobbs, and you realize that those two dynamics, those two totalitarian suppression systems of controlling populations around the world, you see women. You see women being suppressed in extraordinary ways, and to actually tell women. Orrin Hatch and Rudy Giuliani ought to be in your OBGYN and deciding what you would do with your body and whether you're. If the state can force you to bear a child, if the state can do forced pregnancy and has control over your reproductive system, I said let's propose having control over male reproduction. Can they also force vasectomies? Let's have an unwanted pregnancy responsibility act, and you either post a bond for the children you're going to irresponsibly father or not claim, or you get a vasectomy. That's your choice.
Ouch.
So let's not forget the patriarchal wing of the system of oppression.
Yeah. Dr. Tyrone Howard, I want to come back to you. You shared with us this brilliant quote that I love from Malcolm X. Education is our passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. And yet, one of the things that has to be, it seems to me, on our list of things that are fiercely urgent is the notion of education and this achievement gap that frightens me every time I look at it. What say you about that?
Yeah, I say we all should be alarmed because this is a result of opportunity gaps, which then translate to educational gaps. Educational gaps lead to occupation gaps, and occupation gaps lead to wealth gaps. We have to recognize that we are at a moment where we are not ready for this new economy. New industries such as biotech, internet, IT, information systems, we're not there. And we're not there because if you look at data, it shows that 63% of black kids are not reading at grade level. Close to 70% are not doing math at grade level. Black kids are more likely to be punished, suspended, and expelled from schools. We have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to send black children into schools that were never designed for them in the first place? What does it mean to send black children into the hands of mostly white women who have very much sort of antagonistic relationship with black children? We saw all the uproar that happened over the past couple of years around critical race theory. Just a conversation about the ways in which race and racism is intersected with the law in this country, which to me is unequivocal. Connie Rice has been talking about this for decades so eloquently. But just the fact that white folks were upset and some confused black folks were upset about us having conversations about critical race theory. What do you think it means to see the ways in which black minds and black bodies are reduced to being inhumane or seen as being uneducable, who are rendered as being unnecessary, the kind of what I call instructional violence and neglect that we see happening with textbooks and with curriculum? We need to be up in arms about what happens in schools every day. So what we did was we saw a lot of black folks ran to these charter schools across the country, and because it was new and because it was shiny, we thought it was better. But in many cases, we see that we were sold a bill of goods. Again, coming back to Malcolm, we were hoodwinked and bamboozled because the data says that for a lot of these charter schools, they are significantly worse than the traditional public schools that we were sending our kids to in the first place. So we got to go back to what, again, I come back to Fannie Lou Hamer and the whole Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party did. They had freedom schools. They educated their own, steeped in their own culture, rich in their own history, centered around love of black folks and black people, lifting up the best of black excellence. We still see these models today with our historical black colleges and universities. We have a recipe of how to educate black children. The question is, when we start recognizing that putting the best and brightest that we have, our young people, in the hands of those who just don't see them, who just don't care about them, who just don't love them, is a recipe for disaster 10 times out of 10.
Michael Eric Dyson, I don't want to color this question much more than this, and I want to give you as much canvas as you need to paint. But what frightens you most about the future that black folk are facing? Black folk in particular. What frightens you most about the future that we are facing?
Envy not the ways of your oppressor. And when I hear Drs. Rice and Howard speak about what we're up against, I see it frighteningly in a group of young people who have Afro-amnesia, who have black forgetfulness about the struggles from which we emerge. Cancel culture is a replication of slave ambition. Cancel culture from our end, not the kind of, ratcheted up phoniness of the orange apparition that beclouds the American imagination. But I'm talking about the cancel culture where ain't no forgiveness. You make one mistake, you're done. Zero tolerance is a right-wing concept introduced to put Negroes in jail and keep them there and to kick kids out of school. So when I see us replicating that all over social media, you mess up, you're done. You say one wrong thing, you're out of here. You don't have the wiggle room to gain competency toward the ends for which you have devoted your life. And so that scares me, not as much quite as white supremacy, but it's white supremacy by reference. And it's the inability to say to ourselves, we have always believed in forgiveness and restoration. Restorative justice is what we're about, not vengeance. Because I see some social movements that are motivated by vengeance. And they'll tell you, I don't care if this guy may suffer. That's just the kind of violence we have to do in order to achieve our goals. King was always careful about the ends have to adhere in order to achieve the means have to adhere to the ends. And I think that's what frightens me in many ways when I see these young people.
Connie Rice, you and I this conversation is being heard across the country, of course, but we are seated in Los Angeles at the moment, and the whole nation has been watching what's been happening in our city with this leaked audio tape where these 4 Latino leaders were demonizing and attempting to disenfranchise black power, black people, black electeds in this city. It's become such a national story that the president even came out and said forcefully that all 4 of these Latino leaders need to resign. Without getting into the weeds of the story, which I think most people have heard about, the question I want to raise for you is whether or not that frightens or concerns you. We are becoming fastly, as you know, just a few years away from being a majority-minority country. But in many ways, it seems to me that that's going to put us to more of these black-brown fights. And I'm trying to figure out, as we navigate the urgency of now, the fierce urgency of now, how we are going to coexist with others, and particularly when those others we find out on secret tapes ain't got our backs.
Tavis, when you're talking about raw power and the division of political lines and so all the redistricting conversations are about the different tribes. The question is, with what intent are you looking at the other tribes? When the Voting Rights Act folks like MALDEF and NAACP Legal Defense Fund and all that, when we had influence in that because the Voting Rights Act was still in place, we had conversations about, okay, we got Armenians in Glendale. What do they need? We got 4 different Jewish communities on the west side. What do they need? We got at least 5 different African American neighborhoods. What do they need? So you went, but the conversation was going tribe by tribe because that's how we've organized ourselves, that's how we live. We're segregated and we cluster with one another. But it was a one of inclusion. Mm-hmm. The whole motivation was to try and get everybody around the table. And L.A. is a tapestry of tribes. I mean, it's a city-state of tribes. So you had to have those conversations. The problem with this conversation was that it was about annihilation. It was about taking out African-American power, suppressing indigenous Oaxacan power, and talking about Jews. I mean, it was a little festival of hate there, you know. But here's why I'm not worried about it, because the coalitions that built this city are still there. When you saw the groups protesting in City Hall, they were Oaxacan, they were Mexican American, they were Guatemalan American, they were immigrants from every diaspora you can think of. They were Asian, there were Korean Americans there, there were African Americans there, there were Ethiopians there. I mean, it was a rainbow coalition of y'all, that's not us. Now, had this conversation happened in Alabama, they'd be running all four for governor. But here in LA, we're forcing them to resign. Mm-hmm. Now, I know these folks individually. I think there was a range of it. We don't need to get into that. I think there's always redemption, but you got to resign first, because you cannot lead in a multiracial city like Los Angeles. Once you've lost the trust. And it's not that those conversations don't happen in other communities. Plus it was about talking about a black child of a gay couple. Now, you know, in the black community, the homophobia is rampant. So let's not pretend that we don't have those, and we don't have to struggle with those isms in our backyard, too. But when it comes to sharing power, you cannot have any dominant group that is about annihilating, Xing out, excommunicating any other group. And this was about reducing black. There is a problem of Latino underrepresentation. They are the majority of the population, but their representation does not reflect that. But you don't go about solving that problem by Xing out the African Americans. Now, I'm not worried about it, because I know those coalitions. And they're what make this city run. They're the engine that makes the city run. Doesn't mean it will always hold, but the reaction to it gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. Michael A. Dyson, we are days away now from these all-important midterm elections across the country, and Ashley Woody Henderson made the point in the first hour that we can't keep telling folk as if it's going to work. This is the most important election of your lifetime. That line eventually loses its power. It may have a long time ago. But what are your concerns vis-a-vis the future of black people and this election in November?
Well, you can tell Negroes the most important breath you're going to take is your next one every time, and it is. Because if you don't take it, you dead. So it is amazing to me. Look, we shouldn't have to be saying this is the most important election of your life. Right. Again, so in the same way that Attorney Rice spoke about Harry Belafonte in that room of gang leaders with Jim Brown and American. The thing is that y'all believe these older people were lying, huh? Y'all believe when they died for your right to vote, when John Lewis got his cranium crushed, when people were beaten and stabbed and water hosed and had the bicuspids and incisors with police dogs ripping into their flesh. Y'all just that was play acting to y'all. That's performative, y'all, huh? Because clearly you don't take that seriously enough to let that be the motivation for your vote. Now, I know a lot of kids, they don't know the history, they haven't been introduced to it, and I get that. But the point is that we wouldn't have a 6-3 majority of a right-wing junta occupying the Supreme Court right now had we voted against, even though Donald Trump lost the election in terms of popular vote. But if we had done an overwhelming job and stepped up to the plate, we would have changed that history. It's local state legislators, it's prosecutors, and it's the ability to change the court up and down, both at the federal level, the local level, but especially the Supreme Court, that makes all the difference in the world. If you can't tell folk, and what they coming for next is affirmative action. Mm-hmm. So you think you cool because they're coming after women and stuff with this toxic masculinity that they've articulated, as Attorney Rice said, but they're coming for you next, and they're coming for your access to school, and they're coming for your ability to get scholarships, and they're coming for your ability to sustain yourself. So I think that it is an important election, but all elections are important, not equally important, but they're equally important at the time they're held because of the issues they address. And if we have persistent inequality, every election is an attempt to to try to alleviate, ameliorate, or at least modify the vicious forces that undergird a racially capitalist society that doesn't give a flying flip about who we are as a people.
I'm looking at my clock here. I want to save, not save, I don't have it to save. I want to give each of you 2 minutes for your closing thought. And I think the exit question for this final hour, Dr. Tyrone Howard, you'll go first, is in a moment like this, with all we've talked about in these 2 hours, how do you sustain your hope? How are you sustaining your hope?
Well, first of all, let me say, Tavis, thank you for your courage and bravery and just sheer determination to create the platforms you do for our community. It makes a big difference, and we need to show you some love. I thought you stand up and you take a whole lot of scars and a whole lot of criticism that we don't hear about, but thank you for being a shining example for us about how we continue to fight unapologetically for black folks. So I had to say that.
Thank you, sir.
Also, big shout out to my fellow panelists, the brilliant Attorney Connie Rice and the amazing Michael Eric Dyson. Big fan of both of you all. So I just want to say it's an honor for me to be here with you all this evening. But what gives me hope? Faith is hope in the things unseen. And we come from a long line of people who believe that, we are determined, we are fixated and focused. We are a people who believe that there is always going to be a better way. We have seen more difficult times than what we're seeing today. Our great-great-great-grandfolks can attest to that. The kind of white supremacy we're talking about today pales during slavery, and we must remember that. They endured because they mobilized, they prayed, they hoped, they wished, they wanted for a better day. It is the shoulders of those brave and courageous women and men that we stand on, and we have to understand our history because that is what will give me and give us, I hope, the hope that we need to continue through. We also have to remember that our young people is what provides me with significant hope.
Yes.
We have some of those amazingly brilliant, intellectually inquisitive minds around. These young folks are influencers in fashion. They are influencers in entertainment. They are influencers in so many different sectors of society. Right. We've got to start taking time to listen and learn from these young folks who are entering into spaces and thinking about the world in very different ways than we could ever imagine. So I find hope in our past, and I find hope in our future. That past of those courageous men and women who fought, died like hell to make sure we would have this opportunity, and we cannot let their sacrifice be in vain. But at the same time, we have to pay it forward to ensure that those young folks who come after us, that we do not drop the ball, that we do not let them down, that we do not lift them up with a much better sort of set of skills and some momentum to help them to carry forward. Because if we do, then shame on us.
Dr. Tyrone Howard, thank you. Connie Rice, how do you sustain your hope?
Well, as the comet sitting here with 3 supernovae, it's been such a pleasure to be with everybody in there. Tavis, thank you for everything you do. Number one, let's understand we're disposable. We've always been disposable. We just let 1 million people die of COVID, and nobody blinked an eye. And it was a pandemicidal decision. African Americans have always been disposable, but the rest of the society is now becoming disposable. And when you're in that kind of frame, when it says essential, and you need to understand what strategically has to be done, at not just for short-term, middle-term, and long-term, but within each of those terms, the individual and the systemic. We need to with anti-black bias is so ingrained and so deep, I never propose any strategy that depends on just us. I always tell folks, make it universal. That's what Dr. King talked about, the grand alliance of poor whites and poor blacks, which is what Dr. Barber is trying to do. That movement is extraordinarily important. It may be too late for it. I don't think so, but the window is closing. So it's also global. This is about a global strategy. We have to think globally as well. So to meet these existential challenges, let's get our plan together. But first of all, plan for the reality. This is not Wakanda, and it's not South Africa. We got to understand where we are and what we're up against. We can get a plan together. But we also have to understand not all of us are standing in the same place. I am privileged. My clients are not. They have been left at the bottom of the well. And we need to understand that upper middle class African Americans have left poor African Americans behind. We have to get unified.
Can you give it to me in 90 seconds, Michael Eric Dyson, how you sustain your hope, sir?
2 things. First of all, Howard Thurman, the great mystic, said, never reduce your dreams to the level of the event, which is your immediate experience. Whether it's divorce, distress with your kids, discuss with your mate or your job. The immediate experience you confront has to be put in the context of a long view of history. He said our slave foreparents dealt with the rawhide whip of the overseer, but they imagined a different day. And then secondly, take what you do with deadly seriousness, but never take yourself too seriously at all.
Michael, Eric Dyson, Tyrone Howard, Connie Rice, I love you and thank you all. You've been listening to Agenda for America and African-American Perspective. We hope you enjoyed this rich conversation. Why we can't wait, the urgency of now. We thank all of our panelists again for joining us this evening. This program was executive produced by yours truly, our board operator, that is, Andy Cieli. I am Tavis Smiley, and what a joy sublime it has been for me to sit and moderate these 2 hours. Thank you for tuning in, and be sure to vote by or on Tuesday, November the 8th. We thank you for listening to Agenda for America, an African-American Perspective, Why We Can't Wait, the Urgency of Now.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
I'm Kevin Brown, and here's the latest from the Black Information Network. A new national poll finds 40% of young people plan to vote in the November election. Pollsters from the Institute of Politics at Harvard's Kennedy School say that's on track to match or exceed the 2018 youth vote. The survey of voters between the ages of 19 and 29 shows they favor